couple of years ago, the New York Times took an op-ed from me, similar to the sort of thing I had been sending them for years and years. People ask me, how do you get in the New York Times? I don't know, you try for 5 or 6 years, and ultimately, if the economy falls apart, they look at different stuff. So they took a thing on Frederick Soddy from me, and the editor said, that was good, you got anything else? And I thought, well, okay, the next big leverage point is indicators, and GDP is such an easy thing to beat up on. So I sent in a piece, they gave it the title GDP RIP. A trick I learned about op-ed writing from an op-ed page editor, he said, don't put a title on your piece. The editor likes to think they've done something, and they own it better if they can read it and think of a title for you. Okay. In the wake of that, I met Tom Barefoot and Linda Wheatley, who had just then, like that week, they had filed the incorporation papers for a nonprofit called GNH USA, Gross National Happiness. And I got invited to go to the 5th International Gross National Happiness Conference in Brazil, which was, I was telling someone the other day, it was just absolutely the most productive, interesting professional conference I've ever been to, for a variety of reasons. So that was my entry into the alternative indicators field, mostly straight from theory. My contribution to the conference was a presentation on how this indicator that Bhutan invented and that other people were thinking of adopting, well, I guess my contribution was to give it theoretical support within ecological economics. If you view the economy as a thermodynamic engine, you know that the point isn't to crank resources through, it's to take something out, which Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen called an immaterial flux, the enjoyment of life. You could call it happiness, you could call it well-being, but if that's the point of the economy, let's measure that. So, yes, to emphasize, my expertise here is not in the nitty-gritty of comparing different approaches to GPI, but is kind of theory stumbling towards practice. Part of my effort has been to lobby for this idea in Vermont, and I took it on myself to pursue a couple of paths. One, I got invited to join the board of the VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, about a year ago, and I was immediately selected to be the delegate to go to the national convention of the National Wildlife Federation because people didn't want to do it. And when I got the registration materials, it said, and if you are bringing a resolution from the affiliate, please register it by 3 days from now. And I said, resolution? Let's bring a resolution about alternative indicators. So I got a hold of the Vermont Natural Resources Council board. They approved the idea in principle and commissioned me to write a resolution that they would vote on, and they voted on it, we sent it in. And the National Wildlife Federation then adopted a resolution calling for an alternative indicator. The NWF is the largest membership environmental organization in the country with, I think, 4 million members. And it's an interesting mix of sort of classic environmentally minded people, like all of us, and hunters and fishers, like maybe only a few of us. So it's an interesting blend. 10 years ago, the staff was excited to see this resolution because they said, we tried this 10 years ago and it didn't fly. The fur and feather wing of the Federation wasn't going to go into economic theory. And so there's a mark of change in 10 years that end of that organization has, I wouldn't say been radicalized, but has been encouraged to see you can fight 1,000 battles, but as long as the battles keep entering the pipeline at the other end, they're coming at you. Reach behind that and get at the bad economic thinking that gives you these environmental battles. And that was the argument that got them aboard. Locally here in Vermont, I started lobbying, and Tom has too. We started lobbying elected officials and candidates. I think we managed to talk to all the gubernatorial candidates in the state before they got elected, when it seems they are most receptive to ideas. They want to make you happy. And well, what do you know, one of them got elected. Peter Shumlin is the governor, and he has, you know, he didn't say hard and fast, this is a great idea, I'm going to do it, not during the campaign. But he did direct his Commissioner of Public Service to prepare a comprehensive energy plan. And Tom and I heard, I'm not sure how we heard, I heard from you, I think, that Liz Miller, the Commissioner of Public Service, was writing alternative indicators into the comprehensive energy plan for the state of Vermont. To a lot of people, that seems like apples and oranges. What do indicators have to do with energy? But the connection is, Shumlin was really committed to renewables. He's been reading Amory Levins and a lot of good people. And he wants renewables. And by standard CB analysis, renewables are break-even, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. If you use alternative indicators, they are an outstanding bargain. So it makes sense to roll alternative indicators into the comprehensive energy plan. The draft of it was just released last week. How many, are you all on the gun list here? No? I sent something around about it. There's places where you can, there's places for citizen input. There are going to be a series of hearings around the state, and there's also a website, and you can send snail mail. So in the comprehensive energy plan, there are action points. I haven't read the whole plan, but I read far enough in to see, oh, the first action point is to investigate the use of alternative indicators. And there's a little sidebar box that mentions GPI specifically, mentions that other states are adopting it, have adopted it, or investigating it, and mentioning that there's ongoing work at the Gund Institute doing a GPI Vermont. So we're on their map, and the state is moving in this direction. So, what do we do now? Oh, well, we compiled the GPI. But thus my interest in getting the wisdom of the group about particular elements of it and ways we might tinker and improve it. One pitch on part of this I left out. About 2-3 weeks ago, Anthony Polina, how many of you are like Vermont voters up on? Yeah, okay. So, for those of you who are out of staters, this may seem like, you know, recondite analysis of state politics, but sometimes it comes down to personalities. Anthony Polina is a state senator from Washington County, and he's a progressive. Interesting guy, good guy, except 2 years ago he ran for governor as a progressive after the Democrats invited him to run as a Democrat. And he split the vote, and the Republican got in, and that has made a lot of Democrats annoyed with him. He came out 3 weeks ago after conversations with me and Tom and our colleague Linda Wheatley at GNH USA. He got it, and he decided he's going to run with it and put his name on it, and he announced 3 weeks ago that he's going to introduce legislation directing the state to adopt GPI. Now, in our conversation with Liz Miller, she said, Governor Shumlin wants to be the leader on this. He wants to be out front on this. And we said, plain as could be, well, we've already been talking to a lot of people, and if he wants to lead, he'd better move quick. And he didn't move quickly enough to get out there in front of Anthony. Polina's talking about GPI, which measures natural capital services and costs and benefits. No state has yet developed an integrated indicator that measures both natural capital services and social capital services. That part requires a relatively more expensive survey research, but there is the Center for Rural Studies here that does regular surveys. We could roll some questions in there. And I don't know, he might go for it. So what do you think? Should we do that? Should we develop an indicator that measures what we can call social capital services, what the Bhutanese call happiness, what we could call well-being or happiness if we want?
I'm sorry, this is a question. How would you weigh the two, because they could come into conflict? For instance, which would trump the other? Mm-hmm. Do you hear what I'm saying? I'm saying that, you know, does natural capital trump social capital? But it's, so how do you weigh them?
Yeah, well, you would only need to weight them if you were going to try to condense it into a single number, I think. it's possible to have what people say is a dashboard. So you say, oh look, natural capital services down while built capital services are up. That's the trade-off we've been doing forever. And it may be time to say, let's put natural capital services on the board and social capital services here and see what the interactions are, and specifically try to identify policies that maximize all three rather than finding policies that make one go down at the expense of the other one going up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking that the one thing about if you start to focus on social capital, then you can bleed into a multiplier effect, which is probably going to be quite different than if it's a multiplier effect on national capital.
Same one. What's the
well, I mean, I am thinking off the top of my head, but if Kalina is pretty much focusing on natural capital, I assume sort of more along the payment ecosystem services model, and not measuring so much the social capacity, especially in an era where we're living with healthcare expenses, inflating far beyond anything that, it's one of the fastest growing inflationaries in the economy. So I can see that that could be pushed into the social capital, which the natural capital perhaps wouldn't touch in the same way.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to recognize that GPI does include a lot of factors on social capital as well as natural capital.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm pretty familiar with it.
Okay.
But if you just, I mean, a lot of this comes out about how you word things,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Anthony Kalina's whole thing, which makes him so powerful, is because he used to be Vermont Public Interest Group,
Right.
and he's a really, really good community organizer. So that's where he's, he became a politician after doing a lot of other things first.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I met Anthony in Ottawa back in the mid-90s. I'm not from Vermont, but I know him.
Steve, do you want to talk about the aspects of social capital that are measured by GPI?
Sure. The way that GPI weighs social capital, natural capital, and then more economic indicators is something it's pretty equally weighted between those three broad categories. And the social capital pieces include things like a measure of income inequality, the value of household labor, cost of underemployment could be considered social capital or economic. The value of volunteer hours that people put into the community, and it goes through using mostly existing data from places like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then does assign values, dollar values, to these social capital indicators. So that's has its own pros and cons.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say that the genuine progress indicator tends to, rather than value natural capital or social capital, tends to count the cost of eroding natural capital and social capital. Because the main aim of the GPI is not to measure all the benefits of everything that we have at our disposal, but the benefits that we add to the natural capital that already exists. And the natural capital already provides benefits. So it's what we do as human beings on top of what nature provides. Right? It provides flow of resources, the ability to assimilate waste, and as we use those resources and we generate waste, and if we deplete natural capital, that's counted as a cost. So the natural capital is taken as a given, and it's what we do with natural capital and our social capital to improve the well-being of people. That's the aim of the GPI. So rather than, I'm not suggesting you wouldn't have perhaps social capital indicators or natural capital indicators, but they perhaps might exist as separate indicators from the GPI. GPI tends to measure the cost of eroding that capital, given that capital already exists. I mean, before human beings existed, natural capital existed. Human economic activity has not created natural capital. So the GPI attempts to measure what we do with the natural capital that we have at our disposal, that already existed. okay, we convert natural capital to human-made capital, which provides a flow of consumption benefits, and the cost of that, of course, is any of the natural capital services that are sacrificed.
And it seems like an important question to consider. Do we also include social well-being or subjective well-being? You know, measures that are directly oriented towards well-being rather than the underlying things that contribute to well-being. There are lots of different ways. Bhutan has great examples. Gross National Happiness did some work in Seattle recently. Is that right? Did you want to mention how the survey process went there?
Sure. Sustainable Seattle asks people really simple questions like, do you feel comfortable walking on your street at night? And beginning to get at how people feel about these various domains of well-being and getting direct information. They've had more than 6,000 people take the online survey at this point. It's spreading through colleges all over the country right now. There's a project to get colleges to survey their communities. And I think what they would report back so far is that they find that people really get it when they see these indicators and compare their scores with their community scores and even with other communities. So that's what's happening with that. Portland is just about to adopt it as well.
So let's talk about the reasons to include subjective indicators. There's a great question. Should such indicators be included in a broader GPI plus model? So what would be the reasons? I'm interested in hearing from people. Why would we do that? Tom and John and I are hammering out justifications for heading in this direction, and we just want to hear other people's thinking.
I was going to give a reason not to. But yeah, looking at the websites that you sent out, there was this kind of sense for me that like we're at this kind of point in the world where everyone's looking at GDP, and that's kind of been the normalized, like this is how we're measuring well-being. And so like that kind of integration is like next step. It makes sense to kind of use indicators that can kind of similarly be kind of seen as like more kind of objective. Like we won't get into a discussion about whether or not things are objective or not. But then like as like the next step to kind of like get its kind of, I don't know, like could get more buy-in. I just feel like introducing the subjective indicators from the baseline is going to create less buy-in from a group of folks who be like, oh, whatever, like, oh, I'm happy today, I'm not happy tomorrow, like happiness, that's just too fluffy for me, like I can't trust this indicator. So kind of like looking at GDP and adding a couple extra components like a GPI and leaving out subjectivity. That was my only thought on that. Not to be the naysayer, but to be the naysayer.
Well, it's a good point. What happens if you separate within the social capital model into different capitals, i.e. like it would be a huge contributor to political capital. Every politician is interested in political capital, right? So how people feel basically depends upon how they vote. So, but then that's not, I mean, that's a different kind of, it's a different kind of economics. I mean, it's a different kind of currency. But it doesn't mean it's not valuable.
But I feel like we could still measure social capital like they do in the GPI, kind of like measuring like leisure time that's kind of like was reduced, or like other components, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, like some of those ones that are more kind of based on observations as opposed to some of the ones, when I hear subjective kind of components of it, it's like the surveying of like, do you feel happy today, or like, do you not, or like things like that.
So here's a thought. One of the problems with GDP is that behind it lies, in effect, a very simple assumption. If we make this thing go up, the sheer volume of commercial transactions within the economy, it will produce these benefits. And what many of us in this movement are suggesting is, that linkage probably wasn't so solid in the 1930s, although there was more reason for it back then, with like 25–28% unemployment. But there's not a direct linkage between making that indicator go up and producing these results. I don't think we want to encode the same mistake in a new indicator. Like leisure time up, that's good. Why? Well, because we think it's going to improve social capital. Well, why not measure social capital services directly instead of infer them from an indicator that may or may not still be is related now because we work too hard. So that's kind of the direction we're moving, and it's okay. We should move in that direction.
I'd just like to add a comment now too, that in the last 5 years there's been real advances in neuroscience and the ability to objectify, as it were, what were internal experiences, and people didn't think we could ever touch them. Well, we can do that experiment where I give you $100 and I give somebody else $100, tell one of you to spend it on yourself and someone to spend it on somebody else. And lo and behold, they'll come back and they'll self-report that the person who spent it on somebody else feels happier than the other person. Now I can take your dopamine levels and I can determine that, and I can repeat that experiment over and over again. I can do an fMRI and see which areas of your brain are lighting up when you have an internal experience. So we're beginning to be able to objectify and repeat what's going on when people make decisions, economic or otherwise. And so we're starting to get a new science of neuroeconomics.
Yeah, it's the psychic income, right? That idea of psychic income, the well-being that we get from consuming goods and services.
But although that happens, there's still a huge gulf between consumer attitudes and behaviors that people are trying to bridge, and that really is kind of in its infancy in terms of the neuroscience behind that. And if we were looking to put something together in the next couple of years or next couple of months, it'd be difficult to bring that science in.
I hear you that it's new, but I think it's coming faster than you think, because a lot of the work is not being done in the United States. A lot of the work is being done in other places. Brazil, for example, they're now in their second generation of surveys and of having developed technology of sort of community activism around the surveys, where they bring this into the communities, they involve kids in the schools, they get everybody working on this, and then the community and the political people see the results of these well-being surveys and start to make policy changes based on what do the people want, based on their kind of innate connection, because people actually may connect better, the ordinary people, with discussions about their well-being and their family's well-being than they would about the numerical value of indicators that are based in physical measures. Just a thought. I think you'll see that if you look around in places that it is coming.
Yeah,
So like increasing leisure time, I think that certainly would increase social capital, but how does like something like that, if we just think about increasing social capital, that's one direction, but we gotta think about how it affects everything else. As Americans, do we use up more of our natural capital when we're working, or do we use up more of our natural capital when we're doing leisure activities? I mean, what's the effect of 2 more hours of leisure activity every day? Is that am I gonna be out golfing, which is really hard? I mean, what is it that Americans do in their leisure time, and how does that affect natural capital? So I mean, there's other, like, you gotta look at every linkage, not just like benefit to social capital, which I think is important, but
yeah, it definitely depends on the kind of recreation. But when you are at leisure, you're not at work, so you're not contributing to the production of goods and services that could have an economic impact. But you might be spending money or spending resources to do things during leisure time.
The problem is that if you're going to be philosophical, then you get into paradigms of ideals, social philosophies, etc., which is pretty much basically exactly what the Tea Party's doing. I mean, to try and put some numbers behind what they're saying, well, they don't have numbers. So the whole point is, how do you translate this into numbers? And because of the way our economy is currently organized, it's a dollar value. So you can link social capital to healthcare costs, perhaps, but you know, beyond that, it does have to come down to a dollar value, because that is technically how things are measured. That's our standard of measurement.
Mhm.
Well, you take something like G&H, and you get a numerical value, which is a percent from 0 to 100, and you take a survey and you get a score, and those scores get aggregated, and what gets passed on is a report card that gives people a numerical value that's useful for trending. May be hard to define as an absolute what it is, but you know that.
Right, but it has, all I'm saying is that you have to bring it down to the dollar value. I mean, politically you have
Well, it
to.
doesn't have to be a dollar value, does it? You want a
But that's
numerical
how the world
value so that you
works.
can see a trend, right, over
Well, I
time.
think
You know, that's the whole
this-
thing about doing
You're
it.
introducing, I think, a really interesting point. Should everything be valued based on dollars, or should we have indicators that are actually kind of including other types of valuations that aren't just dollars? I think that's a kind of, and just want to open up to see where folks are feeling about that.
Well, if you want to compare with the GDP, then I think the dollar value is a valid option, but it's not the only one.
But clearly, you need a suite of indicators, but some will be based on dollar values and others won't. You just have, obviously, when you talk about a suite of indicators, you're going to have to be selective in what indicators you choose within the ones you want to calculate. But yeah, some, like the GPI, clearly a dollar value for the GPI is most appropriate, but things like social capital, I think natural capital services. I mean, the GPI, as I said before, counts the cost of depleted natural capital services, and it's convenient to put those in dollar terms because you're comparing with the benefits, the economic benefits of increased consumption, where the cost of depleted natural capital is the downside of the increased consumption. But other indicators dealing with social capital and perhaps natural capital, stocks of natural capital, are probably best measured in something other than the dollar.
Yeah, I can imagine a suite of indicators broken into 3 broad categories, just as the GPI is, at least as Maryland uses it. And as Phil said, some of them would be denominated in dollars and some not, and they could be condensed into a single indicator based on just some assumptions. I mean, like you have 15 sub-indicators, weight them equally, here's your overall score in social capital. And if we've been talking about it, we haven't really defined it. The definition that I tripped over that I like the best is that social capital is the stock of mutual trust, shared perception, common understandings that people have within a society. And it's hard to put a dollar value on that. I mean, you can't say, oh, I'm a little short social capital, I don't trust my neighbor, where do I go buy some trust? You know, so it would not be appropriate to measure that value with dollars. But as Tom said, you get baseline data and you then can see trends and you can see interactions between the indicators and variables that you're testing. It's like, oh, let's see, price of gas goes up, people drive less, they stay home more, they work less. This means they have more leisure time, they're talking more, and oh look, life satisfaction as measured by these questions here is going up, and the degree of trust. There's a great trust question I shared with some students that, I forget what indicator, what data thing it came from, but one of these instruments asks people, how confident are you your wallet would be returned to you if you lost it, if it were found by A, a policeman, B, a neighbor, C, a stranger? And that's just a great question for getting at the level of, you know, the concentric rings of trust that you have. You could even include how confident would you be if it were found by a family member? Depending on the kind of family you're in. Anyway, we just established some base level data there. You know.
It seems like there are so many variables. What you were just talking about reminds me of maybe a modeling and systems approach, because one thing is impacting another, and it may not necessarily be monetary, but it may be. I know working with native populations with my thesis, even what we're talking about, even how we value the land is completely different how they value it. We couldn't use that model with Native Americans because it just wouldn't work. So you have to have some non-monetary valuation.
And much as the Bhutanese have decided these are the things that are important to us, just flat out, we want people to speak, you know, particular dialects of the languages that are available. We want to keep these dialects alive. So they check how many speakers there are of the different languages, and they want people to show up for festival days because that's part of the community glue there. And so they ask, how many festival days did you go to? And we're not going to assign a dollar valuation to that or to church. I mean, those questions are appropriate for that culture. So at some level, the social capital part, at some level there's just objective stuff about are you depleting your stock of natural capital on which your civilization depends? Is your stock of carbon energy in the soil positive, you know, positive marginal flow, negative? You drawing it down, or you building it, or just extracting harvestable quantities? And that's objective. But these other things, each culture is going to, should measure what's important to it. I have a couple other questions I thought to share with you and get opinions about. At some point it occurred to me, well, the point of this is let's measure, you know, we're trying to get at sustainability. Like, decrease in natural capital is not sustainable. You can't draw down a capital account forever and in any one of these areas. Well, another whole way to measure sustainability is to look at, once you model the economy as a thermodynamic system, as ecological economics does, you see it's got inflows of matter and energy. And the amount of inflow determines how much matter and energy output there is. So you could ask the question and maybe develop indicators. What do you think? Is this possible, feasible? Would this be good? To develop indicators that measure how much of the matter and energy inflow in the economy is sustainably sourced. That probably would be strongly related to how much of the high entropy output is biologically absorbable. But you could have a separate measure for that just in case they're not connected. And that would give you a quick read on where we are on the scale of sustainability. Like a society that's 100% sustainable gets 100% of its matter and energy from renewable sources. Right.
Well, we've got those quick reads already. We know how much our fossil fuel compares with solar flux. Ecological footprint is not exactly the most exact way to get at it, but it's an indication. We have the rough numbers already about how big we are compared to the natural system. It doesn't seem to really be actionable.
Not actionable?
That's the way it seems.
What do you mean by that? Like,
well, for example, carbon, or take Manhattan, let's say. You can come up with some number that a fraction for fossil fuel dissipation divided by solar radiation. It's a large number compared to, I don't know, 20%, something like that, 10%. Is that too big? We don't know. Or we don't want to act on it, even if we think it is.
well, yeah, there's that issue. Like,
But those numbers are out there, though. They've been around for 40 years.
yeah, it would be easy to construct to sort of, oh, well, here's the indicator for the overall sustainability of the system. What percentage of your energy comes from renewable? And, you know, we have that number, but I wonder if we should highlight it as a, you know, in a dashboard as like, this is the main sustainability indicator.
Okay, I've got, this is history, but how big is this activity compared to the biocapacity or some other carrying capacity indicator? So we can do that all the time. If the question is, what do you do with it? I mean, most people would say we're using too much fossil fuel, and we know the numbers on that. So it's the details that matter after that. So I guess what I'm saying specifically, you said, can we get a quick read? My answer is, we've already got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You raised a really good question there, is what becomes an actionable indicator? And can we construct these? You know, you drive down the street, you used to see this more in the past than present, but you drive by a bank and there would be an LED display that would tell you the time, and then it would flip over to the temperature. Well, you can't do anything about the time, can't do much about the temperature short term. What if it gave us yesterday's kilowatt hours used in your community? And what if that was on the news along with the Dow Jones? And we had an indicator that was at a scale where individually we could take some action. So maybe there needs to be some design around indicators that are actionable that people can think about and figure out how to use that as a feedback mechanism.
I guess I have a question on how that would be presented to the end consumer, because I think that the idea of thermodynamics and how it relates to the economy is something you can talk about kind of in an academic world, but if you bring that to a person, it would have, a lot of people would have a hard time getting their head wrapped around it. So what would the resulting consumer communication be?
Well, I guess that was part of my interest in labeling it just, you know, the basic sustainability indicator instead of, you know, because most people would not interpret the mix of renewable versus fossil fuels as a basic sustainability indicator. For just those are sort of they have in there, yeah, renewables are better, but they're expensive, they're too expensive. Well, yeah, you know, but it's good green, you know, and they're not. Despite years of my efforts, people still don't understand that. It turns out you can't talk to cab drivers about the laws of
New York cabbies.
Yeah, Brad.
So I have a question. I'm kind of new to this, to these indicators. What has been the sort of the political efficacy of the places that have adopted, at least acknowledging these indicators? Have they actually been used to influence policy? Because that's the big question I have here, is that you can make as many indicators as you want, but if no one actually follows through with them.
Great question, and I can think of a couple of answers, and then I'm going to get Tom to jump in as well. So let's start with Ron Coleman, GPI Atlantic, a model that we are sort of consciously pursuing here. He produced GPI figures, and perhaps it's been done elsewhere, I just know about this one. He produced them regularly and distributed them to policymakers and agency heads, and gradually they came to understand, oh, these are the indicators that tell us whether we're doing our job. Like, oh, these are the things we want to move around. We're no longer going to rely just like more jobs increase GDP and then everything else gets better. So they insinuated themselves into policy by being useful. Bhutan, after devising their alternative indicator, moved into a process where they use basically a G&H impact statement process for making some rather large decisions. And at this conference, the Prime Minister of Bhutan told a story about the question of joining the World Trade Organization was brought to the king's cabinet, the king who is now a constitutional monarch and wants to abdicate. And on the first straw vote, the vote among, I forget the numbers, of something like 17 people in the room, so the first straw vote was 9 in favor and,
It was like 19 to 3.
19 to 3 in favor of joining the World Trade Organization. And then was passed around the G&H instrument, and they were asked to fill it out and give the answers they thought would happen if they joined the World Trade Organization. Like, which indicator, is this indicator going to go up? Is this going to go down? Up, down. And after filling it out, they took a revote, and the number was exactly reversed. The majority of the cabinet decided joining the World Trade Organization would actually diminish the indicators that we say we value. So they didn't join. So I can imagine it moving into policy through a process like, alternative indicator, GPI impact statement process. When I heard that at that conference like 2 years ago, I thought, we're like 10 years away from 8 years maybe. With work maybe only 5. It would take a while. There are other ways. If the thing has widespread support within the state that adopts it, all the agency heads sign on. I mean, you can parcel out the indicators as like, this falls in your area. What are you going to do to raise that indicator? And Tom, over to you, because I know you have some particular stories.
Well, I think what we're seeing in Seattle is the city council has adopted that online G&H survey as an indicator for them to use to help them drive their policy making. And just this summer in July, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution with 68 countries co-sponsoring to encourage all countries to adopt alternative indicators and to share their research and learnings with all other countries. Jeffrey Sachs is leading an effort right now at the UN to bring alternative indicators into the Millennium Development Goals as a way of revitalizing that process. And that's before the General Assembly now, and will be happening. Jeffrey Sachs just led a conference in Bhutan called Happiness and Development. He's trying to build that link between this happiness, well-being work and development work. So I would say it's coming in.
And I was thinking about that anecdote you tell specifically, and not to give away the punchline, but where the indicator set was given to an elected official, and it showed change from one period to another. And the official said, "Oh, this is my report card."
I said, "Yes, sir."
Who was that?
That was the Vermont legislator in the state capitol in May. And there was one other thing.
Yeah. So there are avenues and ways to have it begin to affect policy. When I first started conversations with the Shumlin administration, I was handed over to Elizabeth Bartlett, who was the coordinator of the transition. And so I sent, a friendly, bright-eyed email, alternative indicator, be sure to think about blah, blah, blah. And she wrote back and said, "Oh, there's so many good things to think about. I'll certainly put this in the pile." And I wrote back and said, "Well, now, everything else you hope to accomplish gets easier if you change what counts as progress and success. But change the indicator and all those other things you're trying to change become easier to do." And she wrote back and said, "Oh, you moved way up in the pile."
So in Maryland, they've been using it on an agency. In the state government, each agency is working on how to formulate their budgets based on the GPI. So maybe doing a couple quick scenarios of if we spend a whole lot on this program, it might cause this GPI indicator to go up or down. So really using it as a lens to formulate budgets and spending of government money, which I think is an important action that can be immediately influenced.
And I think that's great. I mean, that's a sort of novel for me coming at this freshly, is that you can use these as a sort of guiding framework for policy, not just like what is the end result, what is the trend, not necessarily just what is, but what lies in the future and how you organize sort of your thinking around budgets and stuff like that.
Yeah, last year the legislature passed legislation called Challenges for Change. The urge behind this legislation was to bring greater rationality to the budget-making process. I can't say that they were explicitly thinking as economists. As economists, we all know that what you want to do is to equalize the marginal net return of every dollar spent in every program. Because if you could ship $1 from one program to another program and get a bigger return, you should do that, right? So you want to maximize your benefit by achieving that kind of Pareto optimality. That's sort of the implicit model behind this budgeting thing, but it's not anywhere near said that way. But the idea is outcomes-based management. We need to measure dollar in, what's the outcomes? Many Democratic legislators feel that legislation was pushed through by a Republican governor in order to become a budget axe. And what Elizabeth said to me was, using an alternative set of indicators would keep the Challenges for Change program from being just a budget axe. Which is to say, if you're going to have outcomes-based administration, which is sort of rational management policy, you need indicators to tell you what you're getting for what you're spending. And then to connect that with a comment before, and what Phil said about, well, you can't measure everything. When you get a set of indicators, you can begin to see interactions between them. What rises together, what falls together. Money spent here might lift other indicators up. We like to think, I'm romantic enough to think that social capital is a whole thing, that anything you do to encourage it in one way increases the whole thing, right?
I think that's a kind of a good segue, because we usually end formally at 1 o'clock, but one of the questions that you threw out there, which is the last one, which is like, what is the role of the GUND in kind of helping to shape GPI or something like that in Vermont? And so that's kind of, it's not a clean segue, but shoot, I just figured we'd throw it
It's a
out
very
there.
forced segue.
Yeah.
Can I ask a
That's what we're
question
gonna
before
talk
you segue?
Yeah, if you want, it's a democratic process. Shoot.
What's your question?
Maybe 50 years ago we were talking about natural capital as pristine nature, but now our environments are degraded. So what baseline do we even have for natural capital at this point? And although a lot of attention is on climate and energy, focus tends to be on that, but what about environmental pollution, bioaccumulated toxins in our food? So there's this whole thing that I think should be factored in, whatever you plan to do in the future of like environmental pollution. What are we talking about when we talk about natural capital?
So here's one way I think about that. Like, if you were to get in your car and decide you needed to be in Los Angeles, you wouldn't even have to look at a map for like 5 days, you know? I mean, you just know you gotta head that way. But when you start getting closer to your destination, you need street directions. Pretty clearly, we need to restore natural capital, but your question is a great one, because if we set up a set of indicators that just are like full tilt boogie, restore natural capital, we make the mirror opposite mistake of the indicator that said full tilt boogie, let's build capital, and not consider anything else. So at some level, at some point, we got to figure out what's the proper mix between built capital services, natural capital services, and social capital services. We have to answer that question. We can't begin to ask that question effectively till we have indicators that measure all three. So I guess I am saying the answer will become obvious with experience with the right indicator.
Okay.
And also through the class, which I think is one of the things that the GUND can do to contribute to this effort, is there's a Atelier class happening right now, right?
Yeah.
And they're hoping to update the Vermont GPI, look specifically at what are the natural capital indicators that we have access to information on, which ones can we develop that might be new and unique to Vermont. I think there's lots of really interesting, unique qualities here that we could start to measure related to the lake, the mountain ecosystems.
Yeah, and there's a couple other ideas, and I know we need to go. Your comment about, Tom, that was you, kilowatt hours on bank signs? That was you? Yeah, cool idea. Phil mentioned the other day, we share this pet peeve that you can tune in Marketplace and hear, the Dow is up, you know, we're in the money, ta-da, ta-da, the Dow is down. It would be nice to get real-time, almost daily reports on the stuff that matters. We want to measure what matters. Well, let's measure it regularly, often enough to get it, to drill it into the public consciousness. It would be nice to have daily reports on, you know, social capital down today.
Actually, there's an example. There's two researchers over in the math department on the other side of campus here who have been recording Twitter tweets. They get something like 5 million a day with a direct connect to their servers. And what they're doing is looking for key indicator words that indicate different emotional states. And they plot in real time for any place on the planet the level of sort of emotional well-being that's being expressed. And you can slice and dice the data real time anywhere you want. So there's a real-time measure of how people are feeling in any place.
A sample that includes Twitter users. which may or may not be representative, but still, you know, it's
Yeah, I
some.
mean, 5 million samples a day is a lot.
Yeah, just saying, okay. Another thing that, a thought I had, that I thought to challenge the GPI class with, although it's kind of like what we would do after we build the GPI, compile it, is it would be interesting to be out there right now with what the GPI consequences of Irene were in the state. The state has spent some time accumulating the dollar damages. And that number hasn't quite yet been published, but it's going to be, I heard last night, billions, or at least 1.5, something. I wish we were up and running well enough that we could just respond like this and say, well, the GPI effect was this. You know, oh, social capital up a little bit with a whole bunch of neighbors helping neighbors, but built capital, infrastructure, whoa, torpedoed, and other things. Now, I don't think we can pull that together that quickly. Sort of the good news, bad news is we'll probably get another chance.
On that